Once, I had a candidate place a fast food order at the drive-thru while on a phone interview with me. If you have an urgent situation, please excuse yourself for a moment or put your phone on mute. I really don't need to hear that you want the number 4 large with fries. True story.
We got all things situated. The mathematics were calculated. I feel wasted and I feel jaded. The process here is so complicated. 2 steps forward and 3 steps back.
Hey all, it's Tony Volpicello and welcome to the Career Jigsaw Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. I'm excited to kick off Season 3 and bring you more insightful conversations about career growth, challenges, and the paths that lead to success. Before we dive in, I want to highlight a special guest we have coming up this season. In Episode 4, I'll be interviewing Celicia Stanton, host of Truer Crime, a true crime podcast that takes a deep dive into fascinating cases. To give you a sneak peek, her show's trailer will play at the end of this episode, so please be sure to stick around. This episode is all about recruiting, and I thought it would be a great opportunity to dive into the first line of defense when it comes to your career, working with a recruiter. I've always believed that this critical decision maker is often taken for granted. As we all know, one of the keys to landing that coveted meeting with a hiring manager is getting the support of the recruiter. So here's some food for thought. On average, 20 to 30% of applicants make it past a recruiter's initial screening to be considered for a hiring manager interview. Let's say there are 100 applicants for a position. 20 to 30 candidates make it through the recruiter's phone screen, and that group is then whittled down to just 4 to 6 candidates that the hiring manager will meet with. From there, only 2 or 3 of those candidates will become finalists, and as we all know, only one person is actually hired. So as you can see, the numbers tell an interesting story. But rather than hearing from me about recruiting, we're lucky to have a special guest today, Michelle, a seasoned recruiter who has built a stellar reputation for sourcing top talent and becoming a trusted advisor to her team. She's been an invaluable asset in shaping careers, and I can't wait for you to hear her insights. Michelle, welcome to the podcast, and tell our audience a little bit more about you.
Hi, Tony. Thanks so much for inviting me to be on your podcast. All right, a little bit about me. I've been working in human resources primarily as a recruiter for over 35 years for the same bank, although my employer's name has changed several times due to acquisitions, which is not uncommon in the banking industry. I do full cycle recruiting, which involves managing the hiring process from start to finish, and that includes helping create job descriptions, advertising the role, sourcing candidates, screening resumes and applicants, conducting interviews, and extending job offers. I started at the bank right after grad school and frankly just never left. In some related things I've done, I also had the opportunity to be a guest lecturer at a local college, leading workshops with college seniors to help prepare them for their first job interviews. And for about 25 years, I was a volunteer on the local Alumni Admissions Council for Northwestern University, interviewing and evaluating high school seniors who applied there. I do really enjoy my job, and I definitely have used my skills to help me do some other things that I'm passionate about. I live on Long Island and have 2 amazing children who live and work in New York City, which happens to be my favorite place to visit, and I try to do so as often as possible to see a Broadway show or go to a concert or museum or just to eat at a great restaurant with friends.
Wow, amazing experience, and it's interesting to hear a bit more about the end-to-end recruiting process rather than just the middle, which we all think about, which is the interview. So let's talk about the career you chose in recruiting. I'm kind of curious what inspired you or led you into recruiting. Did you fall into it? Did you know you wanted to be a recruiter? Tell us a little bit more about your career path.
Well, I hate to say it, but I had no idea I wanted to be a recruiter. I graduated with my MBA and just continued applying for jobs. My top offers were actually to be an actuary for an insurance company near Wall Street or go into a human resources officer development program for a bank. I accepted the bank offer and glad I did. In hindsight, I realize when you are hired for any sort of training program, the company is making a huge investment of time and money into your future, which means they are inherently invested in your success. Additionally, when you go into a trainee program, typically you're not only exposed to different jobs and departments in the organization, but you are given the opportunity to network with various leaders and managers. At least that was my experience. So if you just graduated from college or grad school, as many of these programs do require a degree, these programs are a great way to jumpstart your career. There are also numerous training programs that don't require degrees as well, so just read the qualifications carefully, know the application deadlines, and apply to several would be my advice. The other good aspect of a training program is they are typically hiring for a class of people and want to fill that class to capacity. So your odds of getting in theory, could be more favorable than applying to a job with just one opening to fill.
I love that you highlighted training programs. I too benefited from joining a company in a training program. And there's one key benefit you mentioned that really resonated with me, and that is the ability to see multiple parts of the company, which is just sometimes not something you're able to do in a company or in specific roles. So underscoring the value of getting a training program, I think, is huge. Let's talk more about recruiting and the role you play in the hiring process. So I'd like to start with one of my favorite topics, resumes. So what types of gaps do you see in resumes? I'm sure you look at hundreds, thousands over your career, and how do you address them?
So resume gaps can definitely be tricky to navigate. There is one school of thought that says list your jobs on your resume, but omit the dates. To me, no dates on a resume definitely makes me feel like the person is trying to hide something, and I personally would not recommend it. I do think if asked about a gap or why you're not currently employed, honesty is the best policy. There are many reasons why someone isn't working: a job elimination or downsizing at their company, caring for a newborn or a sick parent, wanting to return to school to finish their degree, for example. Those are all understandable reasons. But the reasons that I've been given many times over that don't sit well with me are things like, I quit because I saved up enough money, I wasn't worried, I knew I could get another job easily, I wanted to travel, or I wanted to be able to devote 100% of my time to looking for a new job. I will say a personal pet peeve of mine is hearing that someone quit their job before finding a new one. To me, that reveals impatience, maybe overconfidence, and sort of an air of privilege as they are telling you that they don't really need to work. It just makes me question, if we hired them, would they easily quit our job? I also always ask if they gave proper notice, at least 2 weeks. If they say no, it shows me just a little immaturity, in my opinion. You should always give appropriate notice when you leave, even if you have another job in hand, as you never want to burn bridges. And by the way, not giving appropriate notice of your departure can cause a manager to deem you not rehirable. You may not ever want to go back to that company and you may not care. However, it is possible for your new employer to learn that information when a background check is conducted, and it's just a bad look. Then there are candidates that tell me they had to resign because they were in a toxic environment, which can be understandable. However, in my experience, when I probe further with the candidate about the environment, it seems that they were the ones causing the bad environment by fighting with coworkers or yelling at their manager in front of customers. And after I investigate further, I reveal that they didn't actually resign. They were terminated for cause. I've heard candidates explain that the manager wasn't flexible with me and fired me for attendance issues or lateness when I had issues with transportation or a babysitter fell through, and it's not their fault, except it was. Additionally, they will double down and blame everyone for them getting fired except themselves, and felt they were wrongly dismissed. If you find yourself in that sort of scenario, my advice would be to be honest about the scenario. and give less detail, not more. And just remember that if you're interviewing for a company that conducts background checks on people they extend offers to, they very may well find out the reason why you are no longer working for that company. But in any regard, it's best to not blame others, to accept accountability for your past behaviors and show how you learned from them and explain what you've done to improve yourself and ensure those scenarios would never happen again. And if you truly feel you were wrongly dismissed, there are avenues you could pursue, sometimes with the human resources area of the company that dismissed you, and sometimes you can engage with an employment attorney who could advise you on the legal options and help you file a complaint with an agency like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission.
Wow, she has shared a lot there, and the specificity of your examples, I think, will resonate really well with the audience. And I learned something new today. If I could sum that up quickly, I think it's more important to explain the gap than it is to simply just have the gap. If the gap is there, being upfront, honest about it, and explaining it is far more relevant to someone like you and a hiring manager than simply having the gap. So thank you for sharing it. That was awesome feedback. So I know in your role, like many others, what you typically do is over the phone. So I'm curious, from your experience, phone interviews can be tough. What advice do you have for our listeners when it comes to nailing a phone interview?
So in my experience, if you're scheduled for a phone interview, typically it's actually a 15 to 30 minute phone screen to help the recruiter or manager determine at a high level if you have the required skills for the job and warrant moving forward to the in-person, more extensive interview. So keeping in mind the limited time you have with the screener, I think it's important that you give clear, concise answers to their questions and save any questions you have till the end, and only if time permits. Do your homework ahead of time. Read job descriptions thoroughly. Use sites like Indeed or Glassdoor to see what others are saying about the job or the company. Don't use that short time to negotiate salary or ask the interviewer to tell you more details about the job or the company or what a typical day consists of in this role. There will be time to ask those questions if you advance to the in-person interview. Be polite. Thank the interviewer for their time and for selecting you for the phone interview. Make sure your passion for the role and working for that company shines through. That's very important. We want to hire people who want to be here. Also, if it's an early call, please make sure you've had some caffeine prior. I've phone screened candidates with such low energy in the morning, they sound like they just crawled out of bed, and it's frankly a problem. And when asked why you applied to the role, which is always one of my first questions, do not spend your time speaking about why you want to leave your current job or why you left your last job. Focus on why you want this job. The interviewer wants to hear that you're running towards this new opportunity and not just away from your old job or a bad situation. Show your enthusiasm. And I know it sounds strange, but I like to feel as if the candidate is smiling on the other end of the phone and that they have a positive attitude. A big advantage of a phone interview is you could prepare in writing all the highlights of your career or skills that you possess and want to convey during the interview, and even check them off as you go to be sure you relayed everything that you wanted to. I also think it's beneficial to have a 1 to 2 minute concise answer prepared to a common question like, tell me about yourself, or why did you apply for this role? Keep in mind that in answering that question, the employer really wants to hear the value that you could bring to the table if hired for this role and how your experiences can help you contribute to their company. Don't be afraid to boast about your successes, but at the same time, don't come across as too overconfident.
That is a compelling list of do's and don'ts. Thanks so much for sharing it. Are there some gaps on a resume that cause you to completely skip the candidate?
It's possible, not necessarily likely. What I do focus in on a little bit more is their stability in each job. For example, if they're changing jobs every year or so, or maybe change a job after 6 months, that's a red flag for me. I know a lot of my managers will not want to interview somebody who has had a different job every year for the past 5 years. So I tend to focus in a little bit more on that over just the gaps, which possibly could be explained.
Makes perfect sense. Great. All right, let's go a little bit deeper into interviews now. And I want to talk about what we all have, which are pet peeves, things that turn us off in the interview process. I have a few on my list. What interview pet peeves make your list?
So, Tony, I do have several, and that won't come as a surprise to anyone that knows me. I would say one is when I ask the candidate why did they apply to the role, and as I said, I always ask that up front, and they answer with how they could personally benefit from being hired. For example, I've had candidates answer that question by telling me all the skills that they currently don't possess and hope that they could learn in this role. Or maybe they read that in a role they'll be doing a lot of presentations to leadership and they've never done a professional presentation before and they're looking forward to doing that. Or others simply say they want more money or a steady paycheck, or that since they've never worked in the industry, they thought they should try it. None of those answers will help the interviewer determine if you are the right fit for the role. Another pet peeve is using language with me that is way too casual or worse, inappropriate. You have to remember that even if you've built this great rapport with the interviewer, you are still engaged in a formal professional interview. No cursing, even to relay something that someone else said to you. Don't use slang, please, and watch your double negatives. Also, ensure that you're not saying the word like too often, which people are in the habit of doing, including myself. I'm definitely guilty of overusing that word. And be careful not to say you know at the end of your sentences. I have spoken to several candidates that do that. I can appreciate that repeating words like that may be just nerves, but if you are aware that you do that, just try to check yourself. And if you slip and use them too often, don't be afraid to pause for a few seconds to gather your thoughts before you start answering a question, as that could help. Another pet peeve is not giving me your full attention during the interview. Once, I had a candidate place a fast food order at the drive-thru while on a phone interview with me. If you have an urgent situation, please excuse yourself for a moment or put your phone on mute. I really don't need to hear that you want the number 4 large with fries. True story. True story. Here's another. I warned you I had several. Even if you're interviewing for an entry-level role, if it's in a corporate setting, I would wear business attire. Also remember to sit up straight and slightly forward to show you are engaged in the conversation. No slouching. I've had that complaint from managers about candidates several times. And make sure there are no obvious distractions that could be heard by the interviewer. For example, I was interviewing someone for a phone-based customer service rep and kept hearing the clanging of bracelets. Another candidate I was on the phone with, I was hearing earrings clicking together on the phone. Just try to set up the environment ahead of time to avoid those kind of distractions. And the last thing I'll mention on this topic is remember that you are on stage from the moment you walk out of your car or towards the building. You're interviewing from that moment on. Every interaction you have could have a positive or negative effect. For example, I used to have an assistant who sat right outside my office and could hear if a candidate was being rude or impatient with them. I also once unknowingly rode up in an elevator with my next candidate and heard some really unprofessional language and behaviors from them.
I am so glad I asked you this question. And listeners, if you heard nothing else, here's how I would summarize that. You need to bring your A game to every step in the process and stop taking for granted the recruiter part of the process. Because as you can hear from Michelle, every step you're being judged on how you sound, how you present yourself. Taking for granted the recruiter step in the process and thinking just about bringing your A game to the hiring manager clearly is a mistake. Okay, so we've talked about pet peeves. Let's talk about the other side of the spectrum. Can you name 2 or 3 things in the interview process that impress you the most?
Absolutely. Someone who's really done their research on my company and its benefits is always nice to hear. It really shows interest in being a part of the company, and not everyone takes the time to fully prepare for the interview like that. I would also say someone who shows their passion for the job and is able to weave that into the conversation is something I like to hear. For example, I had a candidate applying for a financial advisor role explain to me how becoming a financial advisor is a goal of theirs because they want to help make a difference in their clients' lives, especially clients that live in underserved communities like the ones that he grew up in. He also felt that using his bilingual skills could help engage with that community. Keep in mind there are multiple candidates with similar resumes, but your motivation and passion for the role could really set you apart. And the manager isn't necessarily looking for someone with the right skill set, but someone who's the right fit for their team and for the culture of the company. I would say the third thing that impresses me is more of a post-interview item. I really enjoy receiving a thank you email from the candidate. So few candidates do this, it could really help you stand out. If this is something you want to do, try to get that thank you email out within 24 hours of your interview.
So, prior listeners of the podcast, I think you heard advice that I hope you've heard before. Michelle mentioned 3 things. Homework, something you can do before the interview that everyone can do. What you do during the interview. Passion, showing your motivation for that role and how excited you are. And then Michelle mentioned follow-up, post-interview. So what you do before, what you do during, and what you do after are well in your control. And to Michelle's point, these could be the subtle differences that help you get to the next round of interviews. So throughout my time on the podcast and on the Career Jigsaw website, as well as in career-related content I've seen in social media, I constantly see applicants complaining that they've applied for dozens and dozens of jobs and never even get a call back. So I'm curious, since we have you on the podcast today, what's your point of view or perspective on this?
So I definitely can appreciate that. I do have a few thoughts on that. First, I would say ensure you are not only applying for jobs that you're interested in, but carefully look at the job requirements to confirm you're minimally qualified. Next, if available, set up job alerts. Many company career sites have this capability where you could be notified as soon as a role is listed in the location you set up with a job description that mentions a keyword that you've chosen. In that way, you could jump right on applying before the job is filled or unposted. I would also say it's okay to apply to jobs that may seem like a lateral move if it's for a company you really want to work for. If the role has upward mobility, taking a lateral in responsibility or pay, if you can give you the opportunity to get your foot in the door and prove your worth to a new company or in a new industry. And don't forget to explore your network. Do you know anyone that works at the company that you're interested in? Even a friend of a friend who works there could help get your resume into the right hands at that company. Recruiters do tend to prioritize employee referrals. They're actually one of our best resources in helping us find candidates. If you don't know anyone at the company, I would recommend that you go on LinkedIn and find a recruiter at the company or a manager in the area of that company you'd like to work in and message them with your resume. You have nothing to lose, and I definitely have forwarded a few resumes to managers that I received through a LinkedIn message.
Great insights. And what I love most about what you shared is how tactical it is. It's not just go apply for more jobs or keep your fingers crossed or continue to spin wheels. You gave some real specific answers on how to be more effective in your job search. All right, so when you look back on your career so far, I'm quite certain there's a lot to be proud of. What has been the most rewarding part of your career?
I would say there are a lot of rewarding parts of my career as a recruiter. It's extremely rewarding to hear from a candidate that I'm extending an offer to that this new job and new salary will change their lives and the lives of their family. Some become quite emotional, and it's really a beautiful thing to hear. I also really enjoy hearing from a hiring manager about someone I help source and recruit when they're doing really well at their job and are about to be promoted. That's always nice to hear. Speaking to hires years down the road and offering them that promotion is also a great feeling. Companies do love to promote from within, There is less ramp-up time for the hire to get to know the policies and systems, and we already know their work ethic and performance capabilities. So like I mentioned earlier, just getting your foot in the door to take a job at a company you admire that has good benefits or maybe on-site daycare or tuition reimbursement or any other perks that appeal to you might be a good step, even if it's not your dream job right now. Through the interview process, you could flesh out the career trajectory for the role to determine if it will set you on the right path for your future.
Well, I love what you shared about what you've gotten out of your career so far, and your passion clearly comes out, Michelle. So thank you so much for sharing that. Also, before we wrap, I want to thank you for joining today's podcast and giving our listeners a very unique perspective to their career and how to manage it. So before we wrap, any closing thoughts?
So first I would say just don't be discouraged. It's a numbers game. The more jobs you apply to, the greater your odds of landing something. The average job seeker actually might fill out 100, even 200 job applications during a job search. But if you can network with someone that could help you get your resume to the right person, those odds will increase dramatically. Second, when you do get that interview, please make sure you do your homework on the company and the job and even the person you'll be interviewing with. It takes just a few minutes to look that person up on LinkedIn, and you never know, you might find out something that could really help you build rapport with that person and really connect with them. Like maybe you went to the same school, or maybe you both were in the military. It's worth a look. Last, please ensure there are no typos on your resume and that the start and end dates for each of your jobs listed are accurate. And just good luck. And just a word of encouragement, unemployment rates right now are really low at about 4%, meaning people are finding jobs that want them. So it's actually a good time to be graduating and starting your job search, or to be looking at changing employers if that's your goal. And Tony, thanks for having me.
Great way to wrap. Great advice. I can't thank you enough for joining today's podcast. Thanks so much. So at the beginning of the podcast, I mentioned that recruiters are the first line of defense in the hiring process. That may have been a bit of an overstatement. In reality, recruiters are the bridge between employers and job seekers. At their core, their job is to match the right people with the right opportunities, a role I personally find truly inspiring. Think about it. For many who have built long, successful, and fulfilling careers, it all started with an interaction with a recruiter. For those job seekers out there feeling stuck, sending out dozens of applications with little to no response, perhaps a recruiter is the missing link in your job search. A big thank you to my guest, Michelle, for such a thoughtful and insightful conversation. And of course, thanks to all of you for tuning in today. And before we wrap, here is the trailer from our new friend of the podcast, Celicia Stanton, and her show, True or Crime.
Hi, I'm Celicia Stanton, and I was robbed of my entire life savings by someone I thought I could trust. But hold up, let's rewind. For years, like you, or at least like someone you know, I kept coming back to this captivating and questionable genre, true crime. Growing up, I watched reruns of Forensic Files. Later on, I binged Netflix specials, got lost in the fiction of Criminal Minds, and read long-form investigative journalism here and there. Serial was the podcast that got me into podcasts. Then 2020 hit, and in the middle of the pandemic, I was the victim of a huge financial scheme, one that defrauded me of tens of thousands of dollars. And before I knew it, I found myself caught in a tangled web of tears, cops, and courts. Violence wasn't necessarily new to me, but this was. Suddenly, I was learning firsthand what the justice and criminal justice really meant. And I'm still not sure why, but in my grief over what had happened to me, I found myself turning again to true crime. Hearing story after story somehow helped me cope. It was weird, and maybe it was numbing, and maybe it was just something to do, but either way, I kept listening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the picture just felt so incomplete. I found myself with lots of questions. Does the story really end with a headline arrest or a guilty verdict? How can we actually support victims? And what if the perpetrator, the criminal, is the government? The same government that decides what counts as crime in the first place. What does justice really mean? And who is it really for? People have been telling true stories about real crimes since way before we came up with the label true crime. Cautionary tales around the campfire, narratives by enslaved people like Solomon Northrop's 12 Years a Slave, real mystery stories like the old magazine True Detective. As Rachel Monroe wrote in her book, Savage Appetites, true crime can reveal the anxieties of the moment, tell us who's allowed to be a victim, and teach us what our monsters are supposed to look like. It's easy to criticize true crime as sick entertainment, but we can't deny that the way that these stories are told has a profound impact on how we view our world. So I don't think the answer is to stop telling them. In fact, I think we need to go deeper. So I created Truer Crime to do just that. Every week, we'll talk about real people, real crimes, and the real systems that shaped it all. Expect lots of research, lots of nuance, and lots of questions. From Tenderfoot TV, Truer Crime is available now. Listen for free on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts.